We begin with the growing questions this morning over the tragic loss of the Titan submersible in the North Atlantic.
After a 4-day search, debris from the vessel was discovered just 1,600 feet away from the Titanic's wreckage. All 5 people on board are presumed dead. The Coast Guard believes the vessel was lost on Sunday. A U.S. Navy analysis of acoustic data had detected noises that sounded like an implosion or explosion near the Titan at the same time.
We found 5 different major pieces of debris that told us that it was the remains of the Titan.
The debris is consistent with a catastrophic implosion of the vessel. It is a difficult day for all of us, and it's especially difficult for the families, and our thoughts are with the families.
The announcement came just hours after experts predicted the Titan's air supply had likely run out. In just a moment, we're going to talk with NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos about the possible legal ramifications from this. But let's start with NBC News correspondent Ron Allen in St. John's, Newfoundland in Canada. Ron, good morning. So first of all, what more do we know about how they found this debris, and where does the investigation stand right now?
Well, there are a number of variables that were put together to locate. Of course, they knew the destination of the submersible, the Titanic wreckage. They knew when they lost communications, which was an hour and 45 minutes or so into the voyage, so they knew the trajectory. There's about a 2 to 2.5 hour descent to the wreckage. As you mentioned, we understand now that the U.S. Navy, with the use of some underwater detectors, sensors, heard an explosion or implosion at some point. But the key variable also seems to be the arrival of these remotely operated vehicles, which are described as magic-like robots, which are huge pieces of equipment that work on the ocean floor, primarily in the oil and gas and exploration industry. They also lay telecom lines. Once those pieces of equipment arrived on the scene, it took a couple of days. That's how they were able to find the wreckage, and that's how they were able to find this debris field that led them to exactly where it was. Now, of course, the question is, why did this happen? What happened? It's a very complicated investigation because you have a number of countries involved. The United States, Canada, France sent some equipment as well. And all this happened out in international waters where there are frankly few rules, few laws, and that's one reason we believe that this expedition happened out there, because this company, the CEO, Stockton Rush, was a bit of an adventurer, was a big adventurer, and did this almost in defiance of the regulatory agencies that want to keep an eye on this kind of extreme tourism, this extreme exploration.
Yeah, Ron, let's talk about what's next in this process after this tragic conclusion. First, are they going to try and retrieve the debris? And second, more along the lines of what you were just talking about, is there any talk about if this is going to lead to changes in the way these companies are allowed to operate?
They're trying to map the debris field now, is what they said. That's the first thing they're trying to do, to figure out exactly where everything is. And of course, the area is well mapped with the Titanic wreckage as well. But most of the rescue vehicles have come back or are heading back to port. There were questions asked about whether they would be trying to retrieve remains, and basically the answer to that is that it seems unlikely that there is, frankly, much to be recovered. The debris, there are a number of big pieces, but the question is who will pay for that? Whether the company, OceanGate, will now try to pay for and launch an operation to retrieve that material, or not. It seems that the United States government, the Coast Guard, the Canadian government, of course, is a partner in all this as well. So a lot of that is up in the air. And whether this will put more pressure on this industry, obviously there are a lot of questions being raised about why this sort of thing is happening, and what the rules were and what the rules and laws should be.
All right, Ron Allen reporting from Canada. Ron, thank you.
NBC Nightly News anchor Lester Holt spoke with U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral John Mauger about how they found the Titan and the next steps in the investigation.
Joining me now is U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral John Mauger. Admiral, have you seen the images of the wreckage? Can you describe them to us and what they suggest about the end?
Lester, good evening. And you know, this has been a really difficult day for all of us here
But first and foremost, our thoughts are with the family members of the crews and the anguish that they must be experiencing at this point. We put the remote operated vehicle in the water this morning, and then we're able to get images back from it. And what, in consultation with the experts, what we observed was catastrophic damage to the submersible there with no chance of survival.
What can you tell us about the timetable and what this says? Do you believe the implosion likely occurred on Sunday during its initial descent?
Well, it's still too early for me to answer that right now at this point. We're working very hard to figure out the timetable. From what we observed, though, we understand that this was a catastrophic implosion, and that would have generated a pressure wave. And we didn't hear any of that throughout the whole search when we had sonar buoys in the water. And so we're continuing to use data and information to look at that and understand.
Admiral Mauger, thank you for spending time with us. We appreciate it.
Our thanks
Thank you, Lester.
Our thanks to Lester for that interview. Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savallo. So, Danny, let's talk about what are the legal consequences here when you take part in something that is clearly a high-risk activity and then something goes wrong. Can anyone be held legally responsible?
Well, first, anytime you undertake any kind of activity and you put people on your vessel, whether it's a car, a bus, or anything else, you may be liable if you're negligent. But the key here may be actually twofold. Number one, did these folks sign releases? And just because you sign releases doesn't mean they're always enforceable. I have actually challenged releases, and I've had them overturned in my own cases. So they're not airtight. A defendant can't absolve himself of all liability imaginable, especially if they partook in or were reckless in allowing this hazard to exist. The other thing that has to be considered in a case like this is that both the U.S. and Canada have maritime laws that strictly limit liability in the shipping context for personal injury. I've also had this come up. I practice in the Virgin Islands where there are boating accidents all the time. And strangely enough, these statutes often limit liability by the gross tonnage of the vessel. Now, the Titan itself would be in the lowest category. That'd be 1 million Canadian dollars, do the math, but the 1 million for that lowest level. But you might be able to get liability on the Polar Prince, which is the ship, the mothership that accompanied the Titan. And that would be in a slightly higher category, around 5 million. But look, the point is that we have laws both in the U.S. and Canada that very strictly limit the liability of the shipping industry. A lot of them started back in the 1800s when the shipping industry was king. So they probably had the influence to enact this legislation or push for this legislation that very, very much protects them.
Danny, you touched on the waivers that may have been signed acknowledging the risk. Is there any wiggle room there if they knowingly signed these documents for families to file any sort of lawsuit?
It depends on the language of the waiver and also the jurisdiction where that waiver is interpreted. It could be Canada. It's not likely going to be in the U.S. But, for example, different states have enacted different laws that protect people from releases. Everything from the font size, for example. If you put your release in 9-point font, depending on the jurisdiction, that alone might be a reason to challenge it. But the reality is this. If you sign a release, the default position is that that release will release the defendant from liability unless there's some extenuating circumstances, unless the defendant did something particularly egregious.
We've heard, of course, some of the safety concerns people had over this submersible. Could manufacturers come under the legal microscope here real quickly?
Yes, that would be a products liability case where a manufacturer or a designer, those are two different things, places something into the stream of commerce. Now, these cases can hold a lot of people liable, but they are very difficult to prove. You talk to the average plaintiff's attorney, and they're usually not that interested in products liability cases because you have to get discovery of all the design documents, all the manufacturing documents in the history of this vessel, and that might be very difficult. In a case like this, it's an investment that a plaintiff's firm, I expect, would be willing to make. And that's assuming, by the way, I'm using U.S. standards. It may not be the same analysis under Canadian law, specifically Canadian personal injury law and Canadian maritime law.
All right, Danny Savalos. Danny, thank you so much.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi wraps up his state visit to Washington today. President Biden rolled out the red carpet for Modi, highlighting a new partnership between the world's two largest democracies. The Bidens hosted the Indian Prime Minister in a rare state dinner, capping a full day of diplomacy that also included Modi addressing a joint session of Congress. For more, we're joined by NBC News Digital senior White House reporter Peter Nicholas. Peter, good morning. Peter, the president pulled out all the stops here. Why was this visit so important to the administration?
Well, this was quite a charm offensive by President Biden. He needs Modi, he needs India as an ally in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China's influence in particular. The administration would like to see Modi and India be more of a bulwark against China to help resist Chinese economic and military aggressive moves in the area. So that's part of what this dinner was about. But it's also about Russia. The United States would like to see India exert more pressure on Moscow, on Vladimir Putin, to end this war in Ukraine. Modi at present in India has been buying oil from Russia, which helps fuel the Russian war effort. So the meeting was also about that.
The Prime Minister also delivered remarks at the joint session of Congress. How was his message received, and what did he say to lawmakers?
Generally, the message was received very well. There were many Indian-American lawmakers who were in the room, but there were some folks who boycotted. Some liberal lawmakers object to India's practice of discriminating against Muslims in the country, and they were upset about that, decided not to attend. But generally, it was well received. Modi said the relationship between the U.S. and India is a defining partnership of the century. Well, those are the kinds of words that the Biden administration applauds. We want closer ties to India. The Biden administration wants to shore up relations. So generally, again, as you mentioned, all the stops were pulled out for this visit, and the U.S. hopes that it will strengthen ties and friendship between these two countries.
A little bit of what the Prime Minister said last night. Let's take a listen.
We are united by a common vision and by a common destiny. When our partnership progresses, democracy will shine brighter and the world will be a better place.
Peter, in light of what he said, over the last year, India has been criticized for taking a neutral position on the war in Ukraine, its ties to Russia, and Prime Minister Modi's record on human rights. Did the White House address those issues?
Well, there was a 2-hour meeting between Modi and President Biden in the White House. We can assume that those issues did come up, that they were addressed. Biden was under a lot of pressure from members of Congress to discuss India's human rights record. So we can assume that that did come up. However, let's keep our eye on the ball here. In the sense that the White House wants Modi's cooperation with respect to Russia and China. I think that's the overriding imperative on the part of the White House, and that's what this state dinner was about. And to the extent that he can win Modi's cooperation, the U.S. will call this a victory.
All right, Peter Nicholas, thanks so much.
Some stormy weather is headed to the East Coast.
Meteorologist Angie Lassman joins us now for your morning news now weather. Angie, good morning.
Good morning, guys. We've got some soggy conditions that we're expecting to focus again towards the East Coast over the next couple of days. Doesn't mean we're going to see nonstop rain in some of these places, but it does mean that repeated rounds of showers and some thunderstorms will work through. We've already seen thunderstorms along the Gulf Coast today. We do have a flash flood warning in effect along the Big Bend area. Otherwise, some flood watches in effect, too, for parts of Florida and extending into Georgia and Alabama here as we go through the rest of the afternoon and evening hours. We'll likely see these continue. And here's why. That rain continues to work through. We've already got some saturated grounds, and we're going to pick up maybe an additional 1/2 inch in places like Tampa and Jacksonville. A little farther south, focused towards the southern tip of Florida. We could see anywhere from 1 to 2 inches. As we move up a little farther to the north and talk about the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, a couple of spots, again, anywhere from 1 to 2 inches here as we get through the weekend. So umbrella needed. If you live in the Midwest, we'll see some additional rainfall for you too here as we get into the next couple of days. And here's why. This is the first system that we're going to see exiting as we go through the next day or so. That front is going to slowly move towards the East Coast. We've got rounds of heavy rain expected there through the Northeast and New England here as we get into tomorrow. You'll get in on that. But we could also see some stronger storms focused towards parts of the Midwest. We will see the potential for those strong storms today too, but it's a little farther to the west. So focus more towards the Central Plains. The Northern Plains will deal with this. Places like Rapid City and North Platte, you could see some strong wind gusts, some tennis ball sized hail. This will extend to into parts of northern Texas and the Oklahoma Panhandle as well. This is tomorrow. So for your Saturday plans, if you're in Des Moines, Kansas City, St. Louis, just a heads up into the afternoon and even evening hours, you could see some of these stronger storms develop. And once again, the hail is going to be the biggest threat, but all of those hazards are on the table. We'll likely see that severe risk last into the weekend and move a little farther to the east. But the record heat continues in the south, guys. For Texas, we've got showers and storms lasting through Saturday and Sunday for the Northeast. But the West Coast looks great. I think plan your outdoor activities if you live really in the western half of the country by the time we get to Saturday and Sunday.
Let's all just drive west for the
Shall
weekend.
we?
All right.
Road trip.
Good. Thanks, Angie. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.